Good morning, everyone. The Dialogues team welcomes you to its fortnightly talk on infrastructures of justice by Professor Nancy Neiman. Professor Nancy Neiman is the professor of international political economy in the Department of Politics at the Scripps College in California. She received her PhD in political science from Yale University. She's an expert in political economy, which ranges from financial markets in developing countries, social movements, financial crisis in Latin America, to influence the businesses over public policy and global food system. She is also the author of the book States, Banks and Markets, uh, Mexico's Path to Financial Liberalization in Comparative Perspectives. She has also authored many scholarly articles. Today's talk will investigate the underlying conditions that incentivizes the market to result in socially just and unjust outcomes, using the examples from Latin America, Africa, and United States. The Dialogues team is very happy to welcome Professor Newman at IIT Gandhinagar. I'll take 5 minutes of your time to run you through the Dialogues website and the upcoming talks. So the next upcoming talk is by Ghanshyam Shah on 13th March, and thank you, Professor Newman.
Report, these are the ones which have been updated. Much better. Thank you, Sharon. Yes. Yes. Okay.
Do I have to carry this with me?
Ooh, we have models. Very nice. I've often thought it would be fun to play a game where you have to give a lecture on whatever was left on the board before. Thank you for having me here. This is going to be a casual talk. I've written out some notes, but I am just about to finish and publish, I hope, a book that I've been working on for a few years, too many years, since we knew each other, called Infrastructures of Justice. And I haven't actually given many talks on this book, so I'm basically here to give you a little introduction to what the book is about. I'm actually excited about this book, not that I didn't like the last book that I wrote, but that was a book that was what we say you have to do to jump through the hoops of academia. Game theory and technical stuff and everything that I felt like I had to do, and it was fine, but this book is more my passion, what I'm really interested in, which is social justice. As an economist, it's not the norm. We don't ask questions about social justice usually, right? It's just, the technical aspects of this is the way markets work, not, how markets should work. But I've been I did my master's degree at Yale in economics and then transferred to political science and have always been, very deeply embedded in economics methodology. That said, I have become a critic. It's like, when somebody used to smoke, when they're an ex-smoker, they're like very intolerant of smoking. That's how I feel about economics. I know it well, but I'm very critical of the methodology. And so this book is in part criticizing the most common ways that we tend to analyze and think about markets, which is the discipline of economics. And critical about it not just as a discipline, but also because, at least in the United States, and many places in the world, economics is so revered as a science, right? I put that in quotes because I don't think it's a science, nor do I think politics is a science. Sorry, Mona. I don't call, that's why we call our department politics and not political science. But because of that scientific aspect, policymakers tend to listen to, right, and adopt the policies of that economists suggest. And I think many people suffer as a result of the kinds of, especially development policies that I see nodding heads. So I think many of you are in fields where you probably have come into contact with the kinds of World Bank policies, or that are very much removed from the interests of the community. I think maybe mean well, but don't do so well. So what do I mean by, it's a big title, Infrastructures of Justice. So I start from the idea that I ask the big question: what are the conditions under which markets and market incentives will result in socially just outcomes, right? Already I'm a maverick, because that is not a question that economists ask, right? Is it efficient? Yes. Not, is it socially just? I think, however, that's an important question. And I also think that before we can answer that question, we need to change our understanding of how we have typically thought about markets, at least how the discipline of economics has led us to think about markets. So I question three things. I reject three ideas in particular. One is that markets are universally anything, that they're universally good or evil, right? Because in the big globalization debate, you have people on two sides of a pole, right? You have people who are very critical of globalization, anti-globalization activists, right, who see markets as inherently evil. And on the other hand, you have free market advocates, many economists, but also many in the United States, right wing, but who believe that markets are the source of all good. And it's interesting because the debate is not about, are you in favor of helping poor people or not? Because the people who believe in markets believe the way to help poor people is through markets, right? And the people who are anti-market also believe that the way to help poor people is by rejecting markets. So I instead take the approach that markets are not on their own anything, that they are deeply embedded social constructs. And that might sound obvious if you're not an economist. That might sound obvious, right? But in fact, the way we have tended to think about markets is that markets discipline society, right? Or that markets are universal, that market incentives work the same way throughout time and space. So whether you're in Gujarat, whether you're out in the tribal areas in Gujarat, whether you're 300 years ago or 500 years ago in some rural village, that people are individualistic, economic man, right? No matter where. And so that you can just take a market analysis. I can write a supply and demand curve and talk about the way people behave in a market anywhere, anytime. I believe that that is quite wrong, and that market incentives really differ depending on and here's my idea of what an infrastructure is. So actually, let me ask you, when I say infrastructure, is that a word you're familiar with? Okay, so what do you think, first thing you think when I say infrastructure, like when you read the topic of the talk? Nice, the requirements for something, that's a nice general, I'm gonna use that, thank you. Anybody else? What is infrastructure to you? What do you think it means? There's not a right answer. Yeah. If I asked this in the United States, I think you would get answers like roads and bridges and maybe cable telephone cables, and those kinds of infrastructure, right? That the requirement for something to happen is a nice general, but concrete things, right? In order to build this campus, first you have to have the infrastructure of plumbing and all of that stuff, right? For me, infrastructures are much broader, which is why I'm going to use your definition. I love that. It means social infrastructure, cultural infrastructure. Ideology, to me, is an infrastructure. The basis in which, or the context in which markets operate. And depending on those different contexts, I think market incentives will work differently. So I don't think people are naturally individualistic, right? It really depends on the ideological infrastructure in which you exist. Okay. I hope that makes sense on some level. So most of the book then is about the embeddedness of markets, right? That markets are embedded in these social, cultural, ideological infrastructures. And I have a series of case studies that explore how certain kinds of very strong infrastructures, so my cases are all over the place, micro, macro, but they highlight certain kinds of infrastructures and how markets have operated. And some of my cases are very depressing because infrastructures of justice argues that that there are certain conditions that lead to market incentives being compatible with socially just outcomes, and certain infrastructures that lead to markets that result in very unjust infrastructures, right? So there's not necessarily a compatibility always between market incentives and justice. So I have some kind of negative and positive case studies. Make sure I'm not skipping anything. So one of the things that I think is really important in order to understand this sort of markets and infrastructure thing is to dispel the myth that markets are self-correcting, or more importantly, that markets have always been self-correcting, right? And so I think even the ideas we have about the history of capitalism and how capitalist markets developed, right, tends to be a story about how once markets were freed from government intervention, they naturally flourished, right? There's an inevitability to the way that market forces operate. And that we have all kinds of words that we throw around without even thinking about it. For instance, I've been talking about the market. What is that, right? It's one thing if I'm talking about, the market we're gonna visit, right, on Sunday morning, right? That's a particular market, that makes sense. It's been around for 1,000 years or 600 years. Okay, so I'm not good on history. 600 years, that's a physical thing, right? But we also talk about the market, right, all the time, as if it's this thing that exists, right? We give it life, almost like it's a person. And in fact, we talk about the market as having these characteristics of being self-regulating, right? Or free-floating, right? Or a free market. And the idea is that a free market exists when the government steps back and allows it to do its own thing. It has a life of its own, right? So my book really draws heavily, at least on the theory part, on a historian of capitalism, sociologist, I guess, Karl Polanyi. Any of you come in? Yeah. Karl Polanyi wrote in the 1940s about the history of capitalism, and it's still very relevant today. Many social scientists are bringing Polanyi back because it's such a powerful history. So he goes right back to the beginning of capitalist development, which most economic historians put at in England in the 1600s, when the enclosure system first took place. That is when public lands, right, were first, when the government made them private, and when peasants then no longer had the right to graze their cattle. To this is so I'm talking about this right now, and it's so relevant to what's going on right now with tribal and pastoralist groups that are fighting for land rights in Gujarat, right? And so, the idea of public lands disappearing, right, and people's ways of life being completely upended, and the politics of that and the way it destroys society, really. So Polanyi looks at that time period, and actually, I'm going to go back for a second. Traditional historians of capitalism, like Douglas North, those kinds of people, you don't really need to know him, but his model has become so common as a story of the beginning of capitalism, that as soon as the state privatized land and then engaged in laissez-faire, hands-off policies, the market took off and capitalism became this dynamic, right? That's the story. The state just needed to step away. Well, Polanyi looks at that time period and he says, no, that's not how it happened, right? In fact, what happened was during that time period, the state needed to become more interventionist. That capitalism was so harmful to society, that it was so radical, that it displaced people's way of life and belonging, that it led to near revolution conditions from the very beginning because of all of these peasants being displaced, that the state needed to engage in labor laws and all kinds of new mercantilist laws to protect markets in order to provide the infrastructure for capitalism to actually develop. So that completely changes the notion of how, even from the very beginning, there has been no such thing as a free market. Never was, right? So I like history, but I tend to not dwell in history. I just use it for understanding what's happening today, right? And I think the reason why that story that Polanyi tells, that counter-hegemonic story that Polanyi tells, is so important is because it completely changes the debate about market interventionism, free market policies versus, policies that, like in the US, Democrat versus Republican, right? This idea, and that's maybe too simplistic a division, but I'll use it, right? This idea that either the state, it's okay for the state to intervene in the economy in order to protect social welfare, versus no, it's very inefficient and it's bad for everyone, and we should allow the market to do its thing, and the government should get out of people's pockets and all of that stuff, reduce taxes for efficiency. What Polanyi does, if people understand it, is that this notion that we're starting from a free market, and that anytime the state makes a policy, it's intervening in the otherwise efficient operating of the market. Instead, what it's really doing is saying, no, we're actually arguing about what kind of political control will take place in the market. Will it be political control that helps big corporations? Or will it be political control that helps labor? I mean, just as one example, right? So I think it's powerful to upset that story that this is about market efficiency versus social justice, and that the social justice people just don't understand the way markets work, right? They're kind of ignorant, right? So I think it does important political work to revisit the way markets operate. So that's what my book is trying to do. And then once we understand that, then the important question to understand markets is, well, we need a clear historical context. We can't do ahistorical kinds of studies of markets. It needs to be contingent and contextualized, and we should look deeply at the kinds of infrastructures and incentive systems that follow. Does that make sense? Okay. So I start out with kind of a strange way of thinking about things, but I call the way that we've approached understanding markets a project of severing. Like, to sever is to cut, right? So I think we have done this very systematically, almost unconsciously. And the severing, this is what I wanted to write up on the board. The severing project, okay, maybe, can I, no, never mind. It'll be fine. The severing project is in three parts. And the first is this idea of severing the individual from society or community. So I call attention to what we do in the social sciences, which is something called methodological individualism. Very long, complicated word for basically meaning when we do modeling, and we do a lot of formal modeling in political science and economics, right, where we have mathematical models to try to describe the way that behavior takes place and to try to predict outcomes. Yes? Sound familiar? And the more mathematical you can be, the more prestigious it is. Yes? Right? Pretty much. Who gets tenure and who gets hired and who gets published in the best journals. The best journals are the ones that do the most mathematical. Yes, okay. Am I going to make anyone angry here? Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, yeah. And by the way, you're very, you don't have that kind of political scientist, I have to say, right? I mean, I hired her. I feel like this is one of the best moves I ever made, and then she left. We still mourn her. Every morning we get up and we're like, where's Mona? We really... Okay, but back to the individual society. So one of the reasons why we engage in methodological individualism is that it's much easier to assume the motivations of individuals are completely separate from the motivations of other individuals. So you can have utility functions that are not interdependent. If you know math, you know that interdependence between utility functions is a nightmare. It's very hard to actually have powerful models that assume any kind of interdependence. And you know, it also grows out of an Enlightenment project, the idea of the individual as constituted separately, and it can be very empowering to think about models of democracy around the power of the individual versus the state. We have always the versus, right? And so we have these disciplines And now I'm going to pick on all disciplines. The way that the academy, universities, right, teach is, in fact, even a further version of that, because we compartmentalize. You know, if you want to study the way the individual thinks or individual emotions, you go to the psychology department. If you want to know how the individual acts when they're buying and selling things, you go to the econ department. If you want to know how the individual acts when they are being political citizens, you go to the political science department. So I call that a compartmentalization of knowledge. But I don't think it would take very much to convince you that none of us are compartmentalized. That actually, to understand human motivation, we are very much integrated. And you know, there's some very interesting work being done on politics and emotion, and you know, there are people doing cutting edge work that is, I'm going to call not interdisciplinary but transdisciplinary, where they refuse to recognize the borders of these disciplines. But of course, that's a form of power too. Mona and I were talking about this. Did they call you Mona? Okay, or Professor. Professor Mona. I go by Nancy, so that's a privilege too, right? I'm a full professor. I don't have to do anything I don't want to do. I don't have to publish if I don't want to. Like I have arrived, which means that I also can say, it's easy for me to say, my book isn't going to speak to political scientists or to economists. I don't need to do any of that because I don't need to get published somewhere. I don't need the accolades of my, right? Because it's very hard to get published in academic journals if you don't fit in a category, right? If you're not like, people think it's straight. The things I talk about in my book stray far from what economics usually talks about. And that's because I am unwilling to accept this idea of an individual as separate from, as an economic individual, one, that doesn't have all these other motivations, and two, as an individual separate from community or society. Let me give you an example of this. And now I will be empirical, a little bit empirical. Let's ask whether or not the assumption that individuals are self-interested, right? Whether or not that holds water, whether or not it's true. Well, you know, the field of behavioral economics and psychology a little bit have done many studies now where they make experiments on people. They have groups like this, and they have them do, they give them a certain amount of money, and they have them decide how much to keep for themselves and how much to give to the public good. Yeah? And you know, they're set up in different ways, but they've run these experiments hundreds of thousands of times. Like, behavioral economics is very interested in this question of testing the self-interest assumption. Yeah? Well, guess what? I mean, you can guess, right? It does not hold water. The predictions, the economics predictions say people should give in minuscule amounts to the public good. There's no incentive for individuals, if they're really self-interested, to give to the public good. And in fact, every time they run these studies, people give between, the last studies I read, between 20 and 40%, right? People are not selfish. Strange, considering the politics of today, but it seems that doesn't hold water. There's actually only one group of people who consistently meet the expectations of self-interest. Any guesses of which groups actually do give minimally to the social good and meet? Yeah? Which group? Corporations? Yeah, not really. Business people, they've done things on business people. They give, you know, it's interesting. That's a good guess, though. Did he say corporations? Did I get that right? Yeah. Econ PhD students. Yes. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like, if you believe that it is irrational, if you really believe that it's irrational to not be self-interested, then you've been trained ideologically, right? So it's not that they're more I don't think it's that they're more selfish. It's just that, like, it's deeply ingrained that this is naturally the way individuals behave, right? So this is just to say that I think there are plenty of situations where people are self-interested, but I don't think it's natural, like Adam Smith would have said, like, you know, individualism. I think it's ideological. You need to be trained. Yes, okay. So that's why my infrastructures of justice looks at conditions where ideological infrastructures might change the way market incentives actually work. So I have a Cuban case study, like Cuban financial reform, and how different in Cuba things are, because people have a very socialist mindset. Now, and when I say socialist, I mean, you know, I've been to Vietnam just recently. They're socialists too. You know, you might have a government that calls themselves socialist, nationalist, socialist, right? But actually in Cuba, they really are socialists. Like, people believe in socialism. You know, universal education, not one child on the street barefoot, not in school. That's not to say that people aren't poor, but it's a very different kind of, right? And so that infrastructure, ideological infrastructure, really changes the way policies get implemented and the way people react to policies. What's even possible in terms of passing laws and policies. Okay, so critique of the idea of the individual. I also really, I'm going to go farther than to, some economists have now, because behavioral economists have shown that it's not true that people are self-interested. So they've tried to adjust the models, and they've tried to account for what they call altruism, selflessness. And what they do is they take individual utility functions, still assuming the separateness of individuals, and they just put in a variable for altruism, right? People get something from being altruistic, and that's how we're going to explain. It's very dissatisfying because it still sticks with this idea that that people see themselves as completely separate individuals, and the only reason why they give charity or, right, is that they get some feeling of good from it. And there may be some truth to that. But I think for the most part, it's not the motivation. I truly believe that we need to go back first to question even the idea of identity as an individual. There are many people who live in very individualistic societies, like the US, not all communities in the US, but many, who really think more like this. But if you're a part of a community, how many people feel like their identities are strongly associated with family, broader clan, community, where it's hard when you're thinking about what you're going to do to, like, separate your interests from where you belong? Yeah? Does that make sense? You know, there's different degrees of this. Well, I did a case study in Uganda, of an interfaith coffee cooperative. They make a coffee called Delicious Peace, as in, peace, not war, right? Delicious Peace. And it's Christians, Muslims, and Jews, all Black Africans, right? But living in this, and it's a long story. I can tell you later how Black African Jews ended up in this village in Uganda. It's a fascinating story, but they did. So, and they're very strongly identified. So these three religions that are just over the border in the Congo are killing each other over these differences. In this village, strong cooperation. They run this coffee cooperative, a fair trade coffee cooperative together, and all of the proceeds from this coffee cooperative, where they sell all around the world and through a organization in San Francisco in the United States, they make a lot of money. They've used all that money to develop within the community and to build a school where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim kids go to school together. And they share governance on the board, right? Equal, including equal men and women. Very unique for a very rural village in that part of Africa. And so I went there and spent some time. I took my family. It was amazing because I wanted to discover how is it that a successful market enterprise led to positive community development, social justice, if you will, right? Without leading to brain drain or the people who were very successful leaving the community, people stayed, and without infighting. Because when money comes in, there tends to be a lot of conflict. None of that, from what I could tell, very little of that was happening. They were building health clinics, they just a lot of really amazing stuff. So I wanted to know, how is it that in this place that market incentives were compatible with social justice outcomes? And this comes back to my first question of the severing of the individual from society or community. It turns out that one of the reasons, is that in this community, there's a strong sense of community from the very beginning, and the market enterprise was developed from the beginning with the idea that the goal was to strengthen community, not to make profit. Obviously, profit very important, right? It's not like they were not interested in making money. But the main goal, the infrastructure, the starting place was community first. So let me give you, and that might sound very abstract, I'm going to give you a very specific story now of an interview I did with a woman named Rebecca. So I told you there were Jews in this community. Well, they've also managed, this Jewish community converted to Judaism 150 years ago when their king converted to, their king had been, there were British missionaries. Some of you are doing work that might be relevant to this. British missionaries come to Uganda, and the way that they spread Christianity was by getting the king to convert. So the king of this local, and then everybody converts with them. So there's this Christian Ugandan community. And the British also were very smart in that they used, this is going to be very relevant. I haven't given this talk in the context of a former British colony. The British would use the local power, the kings, to fight their wars for them, right? So they would spread by using, and then they would give them the power, right? Then there's a legacy of political power left in the country after the British leave. But this king had converted, and he did their dirty work, and then the British did not fulfill their end of the bargain. whatever it was, they didn't give him the land he wanted or whatever. He was very upset. And he was a learned man. He had learned to read English on his own and had been reading the Bible. So he's reading the Hebrew Bible, what I call the Hebrew Bible, what Christians will call the Old Testament, right? And he decides, these chosen people, those are the real thing. Now, this is a political move to say, you know, I don't know what, like, to screw the British, right? He really, so he converts to Judaism. And the only thing he knows about Judaism is what he's read in the Bible. So it's old, Jude. It's old school. He's got 8 wives. He's got, I mean, you know, the ritual practices from the Bible. So this community for 150 years practiced Judaism from the Bible with no influence from outside rabbinical sources. So, you know, if you know anything about the history of Judaism, it changes over thousands of years, right? Through rabbinical law, right? So we don't do animal sacrifice anymore, you know, those kinds of things, little things like that. But in the 1960s, an Israeli businessman happens upon this community of Jews. They're wearing kippahs, and he discovers them. And all of a sudden, conservative Jews, mostly conservative Jews all around the world are fascinated by this community. Now back to Rebecca. The way they have made, besides the coffee, the way they've made a lot of money is they knit kippot, the little skull cap, yarmulkes, yeah? And they sell them. They're beautiful, many colors, and right, they're very special, and they sell them to Jews all over the world. So this woman, Rebecca, started a women's cooperative knitting kippot, but not just Jewish women in the village. Again, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women all knitting these for social enterprise to make, and they very successful. They've made a lot of money. So I asked her, she started the thing, and she's very talented. She can knit these things faster than anyone else, she tells me. She's very proud of this, right? And so I interview her, I want to know about how the enterprise works, blah, 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 blah. And I say to her, so Rebecca, how do you pay the women, right? How do they make the money? And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, do you pay them per kippah? For every one that they knit, do you? And she says, no. We all knit, whatever we knit, and then whatever money we make, we decide as a group how much to put back into materials and how much to take out, and then we share equally. And I say to her, because I'm still in the economics mindset, I say to her, but Rebecca, what incentive is there for people to knit faster? I'm like, you knit 10 times faster, right? Don't you want to incentivize people to knit more if you paid them per kippah? And she looks at me and she says, Nancy, she says, I know what you're talking about. And she's like, and I'm perfectly aware of, economic incentives. She says, but what you need to understand is we could do that and we might get people to knit faster for a little while, but our community would be devastated. The infighting, the feelings of not belonging, would be devastated. And she said, and number one, why are we doing any of this? It's to support our community. So that is an example on a very micro level of where the infrastructure changes the way the market operates. So this universal idea of individual incentivization and efficiency and productivity, out the window. And yet, not irrational. this is the thing. When I interviewed her, I felt like what they were doing, I think most economists would just say, well, they're irrational. They just don't understand the way markets work, right? They're not, but in fact, her explanation was 100% rational. So I've coined a term in my book called the rationality of justice, right? Which flips this idea that you're either a social justice advocate, irrational on the one hand, right? Or you know how markets work. You're a free market, right? So I thought that there were many other examples, obviously, in this article, which I've published actually, and it's going to be a chapter in my book. But that story felt like it really captured the core of like why methodological individualism is problematic. How am I doing on time? Perfect. Okay. I will very quickly put up the other two. Market from society. And present from past, which I've talked about a little bit already. So I think all of this could be understood as a project of these three kinds of severing. Understanding the individual is separate from community, problem. Understanding the market as separate from the rest of society, what counts as the market versus what, right? So when we think about rational individuals, we think about, for instance, more is always better, right? Like the way we get happiness is from consuming goods, right? And so the idea is that that you're always better off having more than less, right? But that's very much thinking about the market as separate from everything else. If we think about more holistically the kinds of things that make us happy, then more is not always better. In fact, we do again have empirical evidence from psychologists who do happiness studies, right? Very interesting stuff, right? A lot of data, survey data asking people about satisfaction and what actually makes them happy. Does anybody know what there are different studies, but over and over again, what the sort of top things that make people, that tend to be correlated with happiness? Yes, it's called positive psychology, yes. Yes, absolutely. That's number one, right? Income is like 5 and is negatively correlated with happiness after a certain amount. I'm not going to be below whatever it is, poverty levels, right? Obviously, people are stressed if they don't have enough money to eat. But over that, not correlated. But yes, they've even tried to, I love social scientists. Like everything has to be very data point, right? So they've even calculated like the number of friends, like how many friends you have that you can have intimate conversations with, that you can talk about, right? So there are all these ways of designating, but whatever it is, it's friends and family, right? That's what makes, and sometimes, and this is the part where it's like, okay, an economist might say, that's fine, we're concerned with this realm, right? People might, and in fact, this idea, the artificial wall between the market and the rest of society, is at the core of the development of modern neoclassical economics. Hayek, a very well-known liberal economic scholar, right, free marketeer, in fact, argued very strongly that for the idea of economic man as, that it was very important that we act different in the realm of the market. And he talked about the realm of kinship and family, and that was a realm where we could literally act irrationally, right? So that's the realm of irrationality. Funny that it's also the realm associated with women, right? So there's a very patriarchal kind of idea in this idea of economic man, right? So man, rational, profit maximizing, woman, irrational, sometimes hysterical, right? Not concerned with family, whatever. But if we take this data that we know about happiness and what actually satisfies people, which is the rational, right? It seems to me that if you're actually pursuing interests that are about kinship and family and not maximizing income, that's more rational. Because think about it, the reason why economists or any of the development models use income is not because income is happiness. It's a proxy for happiness. It's the best way we have, according to the models, it's the best proxy we have for measuring satisfaction. Utility is supposed to be about happiness, right? So it feels to me like we need to readjust, and when we talk about models of maximizing happiness, that we need to include in those functions things that are not just in the market realm. So having more technology or television, let's say, as a good in the market, more better, right? But more isn't necessarily better when it comes to happiness, because the more we are exposed to advertising, the more we are exposed to material goods, and the more we're exposed to material goods in the function of other people having material goods, the less happy we are, because we can never have enough, right? It's this constant, I've been more interested in Gandhian economic models and philosophy because it really gets to the heart of this idea, right? It's not irrational. It's a very clear market philosophy, right? And economic philosophy, but it captures this idea of not being too narrow in the way that we define what it is that makes human satisfaction, right? And that economic models that actually build up community rather than building up individuals is likely to be a better outcome, even efficiency-wise. Okay, so I'll talk about the last one. I've talked about the ahistorical nature of economics a little bit, and so that's what I mean by severing the present from the past. If we don't have a clear sense of the way markets came about, the way our capitalist markets developed, then that very much informs the way that we think about policy, and particularly economic reform, and especially when we're talking about liberalization, right? The move towards free market reforms, which have been pushed all over the world. And so my Cuban case study actually looks at the way the Cubans have liberalized the market, and they have engaged in much market liberalization, but it's been very strongly within the context of a socialist framework, which I think is different from China and different from Vietnam even, right? Where, in fact, those places are much more free market oriented, right? The Cubans have maintained a very strong sense of when they liberalize the financial market, of not allowing foreign banks to come in or or large monopoly banks to come in and overtake the state banking system. So my expertise, my first book, was all about financial liberalization and models all over the world, looking at models all over the world. Mexico was one of my cases, but I also looked at South Korea, Taiwan, Turkey. So I had all kinds of cases, and what was interesting is that in almost every single case of liberalizing the financial market, the story was the same. The story was basically, you have state-owned banks. It may be the same here too, I don't know. You have state-owned banks. The banks then, in the name of liberalization, the banks get sold to private enterprises. They become private. And that process, instead of moving to a free market competitive banking system, it's a rent-seeking process. It's basically, a free-for-all of the most powerful people, groups, being able to buy up the government, right? And the government making deals, right? So it moves from an inefficient government monopoly banking system to an inefficient private market monopoly system. The difference is that the private market monopoly don't really have any accountability to the people, right? And so we've seen financial crisis after financial crisis. I mean, we know the story, right? And the suffering that's happened because of it. Cuba has largely managed to liberalize their financial market, not completely, but liberalize without selling off to powerful private enterprises. And that's because they have a very strong core ideology that governs, right? Even the liberalization of other enterprises. If a foreign company multinational corporation wants to come in and operate in Cuba, they have to follow very strict labor rules, right? Compare that to anywhere else in the world, right? Where Nike comes into Bangladesh or whoever Nike hires to open a sweatshop, right? There's no accountability to the local. So the other thing that I did it's a little radical, that I did with this Cuban case study is I found a treasure trove there's a conference that happens every year in Miami. So I don't know if you all are familiar with Miami, Florida. It's the state in the southeast corner of the United States, where almost all of the Cuban immigrants have come. That is the the capitalists who had the money, who left the island when Castro came in and the revolution happened, right? They all relocated to Miami. And now that original cadre of people, if I need to call them a cadre, are very powerful in the financial industry in the United States. They're mostly bankers. So once a year, they have a big international finance conference at the University of Miami. And they give papers on financial liberalization in Cuba. But of course, they're not in Cuba, they're in the United States, but it's a plan. So for 15 years, every year, the plan was how they were going to liberalize the Cuban financial market when Castro dies, or when they push Castro out, because they also had a lot of coup attempts, right? So it's true. So I had papers, so many papers to analyze. And what was interesting was these plans looked like exactly the plan that you could have mapped it onto how financial liberalization actually took place in Mexico, in South Korea, everywhere, right? These would have been the people who were rent seeking to buy up the state-run banks, but they didn't get to. right? Because Castro outlasted, and they stopped having the conference finally in 2006, I think. But for years and years, they planned and planned. So I think that's an interesting example. It kind of lays bare the fact that the financial liberalization processes that happen all over the world are very politically motivated. They're not about the free market. And I think the Cuban case kind of shows that, right, through an interesting contrast. Okay, so that's kind of what I didn't get to talk about was the cases that show the separation of market from society, or the ideologies that actually can lead to market incentives that lead to socially unjust outcomes. So I'll just tell you what the cases are if you want to ask me about them, but those are my most depressing cases. Very hard to write. One of the cases is on the meat packing industry, which I think will have an interesting impact here too. The meat packing industry in the US. It's socially unjust for many reasons, but the labor practices are really horrific. People whose job it is to kill animals for a living, many every day, very dehumanizing. And what's interesting is that the companies that hire the people have taken advantage of a very strong racist infrastructure. So it's not that they created racism, but they have incentivized and made use of and profited from hiring people, right? The Mexican immigrants at the very lowest rung on the kill floor. That's what they call it, the kill floor. And then they've all moved to the South, where they have very weak labor laws. So African Americans in the middle rung, still very low wages, but they pit African Americans and Mexican immigrants against each other as a way of, right, they take advantage of those animosities. So racist infrastructure leading to unjust outcomes. And then my other case study is Juarez, Mexico, where globalization processes have happened very quickly, and where the infrastructure of patriarchy, the practice of hiring young women, and very abusive conditions. So again, the companies have made money and taken advantage of what was already a sexist, patriarchal infrastructure in order to profit more. So those are, I hate to end with that, but that's the book in general, and mostly I'd like to leave some time to have a conversation and some questions if there are. Okay. Oh, I have to hold on.